but interactivity is complicity to some extent. So if you were playing like a Mad Men game where you had to press X to cheat on your wife, and you're going to be pressing X a lot, then it's not simply a matter of being able to sort of passively say, well, this is just who he is. It's a matter of you like actively helping him do it, so you feel complicit. So it feels perverse, like the game is forcing you to do something, some bullshit reason, and your agency no longer matters. You're just a slave, so that you're just this little intermediary machine that allows Don Draper to cheat on his virtual wife or whatever. And there's just, why am I playing a game at that point? And it's this question of, when I play a game, a story-driven game, am I going to be a participant or an audience member? And some games try to toe the line between. Heavy Rain tries that to mixed effect. And I would argue that it's actually more interesting to be a participant in the story, for the game to treat you like a character in the story rather than just some audience member. Like the way I talk about Heavy Rain is like, you're not a character in the story and you're not an audience member. You're like an audience member who gets to sit in the back and go, no, I want them to fuck now, and then they start fucking. It's a really weird position to be in as like an audience member. It doesn't work in both directions. So I would argue that it's actually a little bit more interesting to be a participant, not just because you avoid all these dissonance issues I was talking about before, but for some more like heady little artsy-fartsy reasons that I'm going to get into now. So this is a quote from Robert McKee, who wrote the book Story, the sort of screenwriter's Bible. And he says, the true character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, the truer the choice of the character's essential nature. And if we apply that line of thinking to just regular movies that we've seen, you look at Empire Strikes Back. Luke Skywalker has to decide: do I go back to Cloud City to save my friends, or do I stay on Dagobah so that I can train to become a really good Jedi so I can defeat Darth Vader? And he's got all these little questions you can see here that he has to deal with internally. Same with Rick Blaine at the end of Casablanca. He's got all these questions he has to deal with regarding like whether I want Elsa to get on the plane or whether I value the war more, my own personal affections toward her. And by making these decisions and by choosing, one or the other, we find out about who these characters are. They find out about who they are as characters, and indirectly as the audience, we can glean something about our own experience from that sort of whole thing. So the proposition that games offer us is actually this incredibly beautiful, direct thing. Rather than indirectly relating to something that Rick or Luke does, we can actually find out who we are through the choices that we make in games that allow these sorts of choices. In Far Cry 2, like I said before, Michael Todd found out that he was the kind of guy who wasn't quite capable of being a vengeful, murderous psychopath, even when he had every reason to. When he had every reason to act out of self-defense and kill these buddies, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And conversely, I could, really easily. I spent 3 magazines of ammunition just shooting Marty Alencar in the face, even after I killed him, because I was so angry that my best buddy had betrayed me. And, there's something, and I didn't know that about myself. I didn't know I was the kind of person who was capable of doing it. I thought it was kind of cool. But I'm not, because I would do that. And there's an inherent sort of beauty to being able to find out something about yourself that directly. But you look at a game like Fallout 3, conversely, and Fallout 3 is in many ways not a very story-driven game, but in other ways it demands that we treat it as such, because there's this whole linear thing about finding your father and stuff like that. And the main moral choice system, I guess, in Fallout 3, the main morality system is this good-bad karma thing. If you give water to a homeless guy, you get a bunch of good points. If you kill the homeless guy and then put a bomb on his corpse and then detonate the bomb and then laugh about it and then run around and then steal more bombs from other people and then blow up the corpse again, it's the evil point. And that's cool for like gameplay purposes, because Fallout 3 offers different perks for like good, neutral, and evil, and the ability to move between those three interchangeably is something that allows you a lot of freedom in combat. The main core of the game, which is just shooting things in the face, allows you a lot of freedom in sort of seeing how you want to shoot things in the face, and to what angle, and how you want them to react after you shoot them in the face. And like that's fun and that's cool. But at the same time, if you're looking at the game as a narrative experience where the player is this character and the player is undergoing changes and difficult decisions, do I want good karma points or evil karma points is not a very compelling moral argument. It's not a compelling conundrum for you to have to deal with as you're playing. Not on the same level that Luke and Rick's respective sort of main choices are. Now, there are games that do ask these kinds of difficult questions. Dragon Age, at the end of Dragon Age, I won't spoil it just because I can actually get around it. But there are questions you have to ask at the end of Dragon Age, like, how much do I trust this person that I've spent the entire game with that I actually kind of like? Am I willing to let my character die to defeat this great evil, or am I going to let some other guy, some innocent person, die so that I can keep going? Because BioWare does this thing where they allow your character from the first game to transfer over to the second game. Am I okay with my player character dying right here, right now, if it means that I'm not going to be able to keep playing as him in the next game? There are a lot of questions there, and that may sound kind of superfluous, but like if you're really hardcore in an RPG, then that character is you, and you sort of have to think like, do I really want this version of me to just die and do the right thing, or am I okay with maybe being a little bit of a coward and letting my friend And in Far Cry 2, if you're doing a permadeath run, which I won't get into too much detail on, but if you're doing a permadeath run, you have to ask yourself, am I willing to commit a great deal of wrong so that I can get to the end of this game and survive successfully? Am I willing to murder people? Am I willing to let innocent people die and risk the lives of innocent people so that maybe I can get to the end of the game if I'm a good enough, fighter, and if I can get to the end of the game and eventually beat it and maybe save these refugees or whatever. And there are no right answers to these questions. Every gamer will come away, will come away from these conundrums with their own answers, finding, maybe, if we're lucky, finding something out about themselves that they didn't know they were quite capable of. I mean, maybe it's just me that I'm the only person who actually found something interesting about myself via these two choices. But I would argue that probably there are other people who found certain things out about who they were. And so yeah, I would say that ultimately narrative games, and those, if I can go back for a second, these two games are pretty non-linear. Far Cry 2 is very heavy into this bent of like players are in the story and like you making your own little experiences. But at the same time, the conundrums that force the player to introspect are scripted, and they're always going to happen. At the end of Dragon Age, something is always going to happen. At the beginning of Far Cry, your buddies are always going to betray you. And so, with that in mind, I would argue that quasi-linear, story-based video games do have a unique worth. They can show the player some part of themselves they didn't know about before, but even if they don't, the mere act of interaction is enough to make the player feel more connected to a character or a location or a story or an experience than you can get in, or at least not in the same way you can get in other linear media. That in itself is a very special, very cool thing. And you can talk to, it's justifiable to say that narrative and gameplay have conflicts because they do, but it's also justifiable to say that to focus on games like Uncharted to the exclusion of games like Dwarf Fortress or Braid or whatever is probably sort of limiting the scope of games too much and painting us in a corner. That's also true. But it's also true that a lot of gamers, myself included, find a great deal of value in linear story-based games, story-driven games. And if we're going to keep making those games, we might as well make them in a way and craft their stories and their characters in such a way that is unique and most beneficial to the medium. Because games are not movies, games are not television shows, games are not comics, and that potentially is a very, very, very wonderful thing.